All right, everybody. Well, hey, hope everybody else is doing well this Wednesday evening. Welcome to the Podcasters live stream. We're excited to have everybody here for the webinar. For those that are listening live, or also join us on the different Facebook groups across Facebook, and of course, those catching the replays on YouTube and the future podcast episodes out here. Excited to be here after having a week off. I don't know about most of y'all, but I was at Podcast Movement in Orlando last week. Enjoyed myself with 3,000 plus other podcasters and our obviously extended podcast family. I think we all fall into that in some sort of fashion. One of the great things, guys, I got a chance to hang a little bit with Ed Ryan from Podcast Business Journal. Once again, big shout out to him. The guys are helping promote these. So if you get a chance, check out, subscribe to podcastbusinessjournal.com there for you. Great nuggets of information. We had a few of our past guests, our writers on there as well, and have regular posts on there. And so check it out. It's a great way to keep up with what's going on in the podcast industry. But I want to remind you all, for those that are joining us for the first time, we are just, it's hard to believe, under 90 days out, actually 2 months out roughly, from our PodCamp Mastermind that we're doing in Orlando for 2 days. It's a Monday, Tuesday, September 30th and October 1st. Looking forward to having basically 50 to 100 serious podcasters just to get together for a true mastermind for 2 days. We've got a great room block there at the Coronado Springs where we'll be meeting at there, just outside of Epcot. We just focus on tools, tips, and tradecraft, how to be a better podcaster, and have nobody will be attending that does not have a podcast. That's a good thing. When you go to enough podcast events, there's always a half group of people that want to start a podcast, and then another half that are serious podcasters, been doing it for a little while. And that's what we want to do, is kind of help iron sharpen iron at this event. Like I said, it's a Monday, Tuesday. We've got a very special VIP red carpet event that Monday night at Epcot for a big fireworks display, big dessert party there. Normal price is $6.99 for you plus a guest. We've got a special room block in there. It's two that you guys will love. But if you go to podcamp.com, it'll knock $200 off for you guys if you register here for you by signing up tonight. And that's good for you plus your guest or partner. If you need to bring a third person, let me know, and we can shoot you over a little special link for that. But I'm excited because I met the guy here tonight at a local event that I didn't know anything about. I got asked to go to. Not from Podcast Movement, but a mutual friend of ours, Steve Olsher, who runs New Media Summit, actually invited me to be an icon. And I was actually in Vegas when I got the invite when I was attending. What was I attending out in Vegas? I don't remember what it was. Maybe it was a concert or something like that. But I got invited to come to Austin. Austin's my hometown. And I got a chance to meet the guy who's our special guest tonight. He is hang on a second here. You're taking the screen over there, buddy.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's all right. Our buddy here is a podcaster 10 years. He's the vice president of, I had it up there, of a Christian Writers Association. He's a literary agent. He's a master marketer. Anytime I get a chance to hang out with this guy, I absolutely learn something new, some nugget, some data, some I have on. And he's cordial enough with his busy schedule, and then also being a relatively newer dad with a second one on the way shortly. But we're just really excited to have Thomas Umstattd Jr. from Austin, Texas, join us here tonight on the Podcasters live stream.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. I'm excited to talk about podcasting. I've been talking about podcasting all over the world this year. I was in Switzerland and LA and just got back from Portland. And the talk I'm about to share with you, I have never shared with anyone before, ever. This is a brand new, hot off the press talk about how to leverage the power of podcasting. So you have an exclusive, at least for now. I'll be taking this all over soon, but this is the first time I'll be talking about this. And I'd like to open up with a story. So Mike was a fishmonger who lived here in Austin, Texas, and he had a passion for history. And in 2007, he started podcasting about Roman history. And he started with a $100 microphone and some free editing software on his computer. And every week he would tell a little bit more of Roman history. Now, this is a guy who was just doing the research as he went along. He was not a history major in college. He didn't even have a history degree. But eventually, his podcast went on to get 100 million downloads.
Wow.
From a fishmonger from Austin, Texas. And I want you to try to wrap your mind around 100 million downloads. For some comparison, there are 28 million people living in the state of Texas. So this is greater than the state of Texas and the population of California combined. If all of those people downloaded one episode, he would still have downloads left over. He went on later to write a book about Roman history, which is not exactly the fanciest topic, right? You're like, oh man, let's knock down the doors, put this book about Roman history on the New York Times bestseller list. But that is exactly what happened. So His book, The Storm Before the Storm, became a New York Times bestseller. And here's the craziest part. This was not a book about Caesar and Cleopatra and Mark Antony, the famous Romans. This was a book about Marius, Sulla, and the Gracchi brothers, which most people couldn't even tell you what part was that before or after Julius Caesar. Like, these are not well-known people. When he did the research, the previous book on these guys was written 100 years before, and yet he hit the New York Times bestseller in his first week. And now if you were to watch, say, a Netflix documentary about Rome, you know who you'd see? Mike Duncan. So it'd be all of these PhDs and the guy with the podcast. And who's the most famous of all of the experts on the Netflix documentary? The guy without a history degree, the guy with a podcast. So you may be wondering, how on earth did this happen? How did some fishmonger from Austin, Texas, go on to become the most famous person in Roman history telling? Why did it happen? Why was it such a success? And I will tell you, it's not because Mike was a celebrity or had lots of experience, right? There's other people who do history podcasts who were already radio celebrities before they got into the history podcasting game. Now, Dan Carlin's a great example of this. He's the other big history teller, and I'm a big fan of his podcast too, but he did radio for 10 or 15 years before he got into podcasting. So you would expect him to be good. But why was Mike able to be so successful? I think there was 3 things that contributed to it. The first is that attention spans are growing. Now, you'll hear a lot of common people telling each other, oh, attention spans are so short, people are like goldfish, and there's nothing to support that other than what people think, right? And you're like, oh, well, it's true. And I'm like, really though? When was the last time you binged a TV show or Netflix show for more than 4 hours? Right? That's longer than any movie that's ever been made is 4 hours. I mean, maybe that's the max. And some of you, if you're honest with yourselves, you've binged for more than 4 hours.
Oh, yeah.
For 5 hours, you've been for 6 hours, you've binged for a whole season of a show, perhaps. That is a longer attention span than we've seen historically. In a 140-character world, people long for substance. They long for something of depth. They long for something more meaningful. And even Twitter is adapting, right? Even Twitter is expanding the number of characters because people are wanting something more than what they get with the kind of flash in the pan social media. And podcasting is more powerful than you realize. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what a podcast is, because I often will do webinars and people are like, oh, I really enjoyed your podcast. And I'm just like, no, you don't know what a podcast is. And a lot of the stats that show how popular podcasting has become, I think a lot of them are wrong because people don't realize that they don't know what a podcast is. So I want to first show some things that are not podcasts. So a webinar, what we're doing right now is not a podcast. At least it's not a podcast while we are doing it. If Scott takes this audio and puts it in on our RSS feed, then it will turn into a podcast. But what you're experiencing, if you think this is a podcast about podcasts, it is not. Facebook Live is not a podcast. YouTube is not a podcast. Now, I realize it can get confusing because sometimes people will record their podcast and then put it on YouTube. But YouTube is its own beast. And internet radio is also not a podcast. I used to be a radio host. I had a drive time talk show. We'd talk about news and politics for people who were driving home from work, which I will say, people are always grumpier on their way home from work for a news and politics show. Like in the morning, people are like, oh, everything is fine with the world. I mean, I'm a little cranky. When you get the drive home people, they're like, burn down the system. Anyway, neither here nor there. One way to think of podcasting is that it's like TiVo for audio. The magic of podcasting is the ability to subscribe so that new episodes appear on your computer automatically so you can sync them to your iPod. Or now we have these fancy phones that can subscribe directly, so you don't have to sync them with your computer anymore, which is amazing. So you may not realize just how old podcasting is, but I'm holding in my hands an AOL floppy disk. Anybody remember these?
Yeah.
This AOL floppy disk is closer to the beginning of podcasting in terms of history than we are right now. That's how old podcasts are in terms of how long people have been doing them. And the technology behind them is something called RSS. You probably recognize this orange icon. We're going to talk more about this icon and why it is the icon of revolutionaries here in a little bit. It's a very good sign for you. But this is what makes a podcast a podcast. It's the secret sauce. So who listens to podcasts? Well, according to Edison Research, the affluent listen to podcasts. 45% of monthly podcast listeners have a household income over $75,000 a year versus 35% for the U.S. population. And it even scales even more when you look at people with a household income over $150,000 or over $500,000. There's a reason why somebody who's got, wants to talk about closing notes, right, which is not exactly a topic for people with no money, would do it as a podcast, right? Because that is where these are people who are listening on their new iPhones in their Teslas to podcasts. Podcast listeners are also more educated than non-podcast listeners. They've a higher degree of them have completed college, a higher degree of them have completed post-secondary education, and they're more influential. Podcast listeners have more followers on social media, and they're just more influential in society as a whole. And finally, both men and women listen to podcasts. So it was a little bit of a boys' club in the early years of podcasting. So I go way back in podcasting, and the old joke was, you have a gaggle of geese and a flock of birds, and a gathering of white men is called a podcast. You're like, oh, a bunch of white men, there's a podcast of white men going by. And if you look at the more recent statistics in 2018, 2019, those numbers are evening out. And in some of my podcasts, we actually have more women than men that listen. So it's very close to 50-50, and it's starting to get into the realm of your listenership, which is more, depends on your topic. So a lot of my podcasts are relating to writing, and most writers are women. So we have a lot of women who listen to our show. And women are the fastest growing segment of podcast listeners, and they have been for several years. So who doesn't listen to podcasts? Well, surprisingly, teens currently are not big podcast listeners. And I have a theory as to why this is. I've not heard this theory backed up by stats. So the why, I haven't heard anyone arguing to the why, but I think my theory is pretty strong. And it comes from observing real life teenagers. Teenagers have hand-me-down phones from their parents. And what are hand-me-down phones? They're old phones. They're phones without very much storage space on them. And there are no room for podcasts on these old, broke-down phones that most teenagers have. Now, as Spotify gets to be a bigger player in the podcasting game, I'm anticipating more teens to adopt podcasting. But for right now, teens are consuming the kind of content that would be on a podcast. A lot of my podcasts. They're consuming that content on YouTube. They're big subscribers of YouTube, and they're big followers of YouTube personalities. In fact, I had some teens who listened to one of my podcasts, or 18, begging me to put the episodes on YouTube so he could watch them because he didn't have space on his phone to listen to a podcast, which was unfortunate, but also very eye-opening. Low-income people don't listen to podcasts for a lot of the same reasons as teenagers. They tend to not have very good phones, or they don't have good data plans. And something I really like, trolls don't listen to podcasts. So as somebody who does a lot of things on the internet, I blog, and I've done video, and I've done social media, I have had my experience with trolls. Scott, I'm sure you have too. Oh, and yeah. I've had almost no interaction with trolls as a podcaster, because trolls are looking for easy things to criticize. They're not going to listen to 30 minutes of your podcast episode or an hour of your podcast episode to criticize you. If they can't find something to criticize in the subject or the description, they're gone. They're off to the next thing. They're hanging out on YouTube or Reddit, or maybe Facebook or Twitter. They're not hanging out in podcasting, which makes it a very edifying place to create content, in my opinion. It's not to say that it's troll-free. Just like, and I'm not saying that there are no teenagers that listen to podcasts. I think I was 19 when I started listening to podcasts, and I would plug my iPod into my cassette tape adapter in my old broke down car that had a cassette tape player, and it was great. I enjoyed listening to podcasts that way, but I was not a normal teenager. So, and nothing has changed. I'm still not normal. Another thing that is kind of shocking and sad as to the why, but Android users don't listen to very many podcasts. I heard a Google executive talking back in 2018 about how the typical iPhone, the device, listens to 10 times more minutes of podcasts than the typical Android phone. And he's like, this is something we have to fix. And it's been a year and they've done basically nothing to fix it. So for those of you who have an Android, there's a good chance you are not nearly as much of a podcast listener as you would have been if you had picked an iPhone. And for one teeny tiny reason, the iPhone came with a podcast app pre-installed and Android phones don't. That's the only difference. There's nothing keeping you from listening to a podcast on an Android, but it takes that extra step. And that extra step has made a huge impact on podcast listenership, so that almost every podcast has more iPhone listeners than Android listeners, despite the fact that Android is far stronger in market share. If you looked at the market share numbers, you would expect a lot more Android listeners, but the stats don't prove that out. Now, maybe it's, some of those other factors about, wealthier people listening to podcasts and wealthier people being more likely to own iPhones driving those numbers. I'm not sure. But this is one of those things. We'll talk about Android and what app to use here in a little bit, because it doesn't have to be you. You don't have to be the statistic. You too can become a podcast listener. All right, so let's talk a little bit about why people listen to podcasts, and we'll talk about how to use them to become more powerful than you can possibly imagine. So podcasts fill the lonely places of our lives with friendly voices. And I think that at a core psychological reason, this is the why of podcasts. If you think about where people listen to podcasts, they're listening to podcasts while they're washing the dishes. They're listening to podcasts while they're mowing the lawn. We have people who tell me, like, you're my lawn mowing podcast. Every week when I mow the lawn, I'm listening to Novel Marketing. And I'm like, yay. Then I was like, doesn't that hurt your ears? But I finally got headphones and I can listen to podcasts while I mow the lawn as well. Oh, we have a special guest. My daughter, Mercy, is about to go to bed, but she's going to come and say, would you like to say anything to the microphone? Would you want to wave? Can you wave to all the people on the internet? Okay, she's a little too sleepy for that. But anyway, this is Mercy. She's my daughter. Mwah.
Good stuff, brother. Good stuff.
All right. So anyway, people fill the lonely places of their day with podcasts. And if you have the opportunity as a podcaster or a podcast guest to be that voice in that lonely place, and that is a powerful, influential place to be in, something to be taken very seriously. Podcasts are also a really great way to learn new things. Many of the new skills that I've gotten have come from going into the podcast world and subscribing to 10 or 15, sometimes 20 podcasts on a topic, and listening to all of those podcasts and unsubscribing from the ones I don't think are very good until I end up with 4 or 5 that are really good. But I'm still listening to episodes of those whole 20 during the initial batch. And I found that there's almost nothing I can't learn using this technique. They allow you to turn your car into a classroom, which is a really great way of redeeming that time. If you're stuck in traffic, not that we would know anything about traffic here in Austin, Texas, but coming up with coping mechanisms for dealing with Austin traffic is a pastime of Austinites. And I can't think of a much better coping mechanism than turning your car into a classroom. So what makes podcasts so powerful? And why are they kind of uniquely powerful in this way of resonating with people? Well, one of the reasons is focus. Podcasts are a narrowcast medium rather than a broadcast medium. And to explain this, in any given area, there's room for about 100 broadcast radio stations, give or take, and depending on how much static you're willing to listen to. But let's assume the number is right at 100 for the sake of math. This means each one of those radio stations has to have something that's appealing to at least 1% of the population to work. This means that by its very nature, they are forced to be broad and general in the topics that they cover. So you may be listening, and there's not that many talk radio stations, so that limits it even more. So let's say there's only 10 talk radio stations in your town. Each one of those talk radio stations is fighting over, say, 10% of the talk radio listener base. So while you may have a podcast about finance, personal finance, maybe you wouldn't have a podcast about closing notes, right? Like that's way too specific for a topic for traditional terrestrial radio. Podcasting, on the other hand, can be much more focused. And because it doesn't have that geographic limitation of terrestrial radio, by being focused in topic, it doesn't have to be focused in the sense of how many people listen to it, right? The History of Rome podcast, which is a podcast about a civilization that hasn't existed for, depending on who you talk to, either 1,500 years or 500 years, depending on what you think the fall of Rome is, which is a topic that if you're curious about, I encourage you to listen to the History of Rome, where they discuss that topic. But most people couldn't find it on a map, right? If you gave most people a world map and say, show me where Rome used to be, they probably couldn't tell you where Rome is now, much less where it used to be. And yet, this narrowcast podcast was able to reach 100 million downloads. As we like to say in the podcasting space, there are riches in niches. And you almost can't become too niche of a podcast, especially at first. And this focus also allows you to eliminate the competition by being more focused than the competition. Another advantage that podcasts have is that they're recent. Podcasts are able to respond to a changing world faster than books and more substantively than blogs. They're kind of in this really nice sweet spot where you can have a really in-depth conversation on a topic that's really important, that's really cutting edge. And they're not the only thing that can do this. Video does this well as also, so YouTube can be addressing cutting edge issues. But this is one of the things I really like about podcasting, especially when it comes to learning new skills. I'll often, once I've read through the books on a topic, especially the recent books on a topic, I'm wanting kind of the more cutting edge stuff. And you can't get that from a book because books take 2 years to write. So eventually, when you're becoming an expert in a topic, you have to switch to the podcast because it's the only way. And often you'll hear experts interviewed on podcasts that wouldn't be interviewed anywhere else. And if Scott had asked me to be interviewed on his blog, I would have said no because it would have been too much work. Although putting together this talk for y'all ended up being quite a bit of work. So maybe that would have been the right play in hindsight. Another advantage to podcasts is community. Podcasts often have a community that are included. And Scott, I'm sure you've seen this with your show where you have your regulars, and your regulars don't just interact with you regularly, but they start to interact with each other. In fact, the very first way that podcasts monetize themselves back in the olden days, the AOL floppy disk days, was to have real-life events where everyone who listened to the podcast would gather at some event, and they'd all buy tickets for $100, and they would hang out together. And that was so much fun because of that sense of community. And podcasts still raise money doing that today. In fact, it's a very common thing. You'll see the big NPR podcasts will go on tour, kind of like a band goes on tour. Another cool thing about podcasting, and this is, I think, one of the most special things now about podcasting is the autonomy. No company controls podcasting. No government controls podcasting. Podcasting is based off of decentralized technologies. It's more like Bitcoin than it is like the US dollar. And in a world where you're always afraid of some algorithm being changed and suddenly your whole business model is killed, which has happened to a lot of people with Facebook, where they make a change and suddenly Facebook Live videos don't get nearly as much of the coverage as they used to unless you pay Facebook. It's nice to have a technology that doesn't have a single point of failure in the middle. Apple kicked off a podcaster famously last year, and you can still subscribe to that podcaster on your Apple device. They were not able to make this guy go away because no one controls RSS. It is a decentralized technology. Big tech companies have been trying to kill RSS. Google had the #1 RSS reader, and they killed it because they couldn't control or monetize RSS, and it's still around. It still powers the blogs. It still powers the podcasts. And I encourage you, if you are talking about a topic that is sensitive to government or corporate censorship, and this applies especially to y'all outside of the United States, but sadly it happens in the US more and more, podcasting is something you should look even harder at. Because if you have a YouTube video, it only takes one person at YouTube to completely make everything go away, but no one can do that to your podcast. And then another thing I like about podcasting is that it's in depth. In a world full of trivial, shallow online conversations, podcasting offers the exact opposite. It's beautiful. It offers those substantive conversations that people so long for. And I was watching Joe Rogan, who until this week was the #1 podcaster. He just got dethroned. He'll probably be back, but he's now the #2 podcaster. And I watched him having long conversations with Jordan Peterson, who's far to the right, and a long, in-depth conversation with Bernie Sanders, who's far to the left. And I was like, this is like the last bastion of like people actually talking about things instead of like throwing sound bites at each other, which is not helpful. And I remember watching Jordan Peterson, who's very careful with his language. He's very careful not to say the wrong thing. And he was in this interview, and there's other people in the interview, and he was searching for the right word because he didn't want to say the wrong word, because he was being very careful in what he said. And he was pausing, searching for the word, and no one interrupted him. They let him find the word he was looking for. I was like, you would never see that on Fox News or CNN. He paused even to take a breath. Somebody would have jumped in and stolen the conversation. And so if you're wanting those in-depth conversations, if you're wanting to listen to somebody talk about something in a meaningful way, substantive way, podcasting is really the most in-depth medium. Podcasting is also not a fad. It's been around for a long time, and I have a chart I'm going to show you. But first, I want y'all's feedback. So since this is a brand new talk, I have 2 slides for this. So I want you to tell me which is the better slide. This first one, which is dabbing, or the second one, which is planking, which is the better slide to capture this topic.
I would say the Dabo, because that's kind of a newer thing. I think when I first saw the table, I thought she was asleep, but I knew after a second she was planking. Yeah.
Okay. That's good to know. This is an older, more dead fad, whereas this is the current fad. Maybe I'll just keep this up to date on my presentation. But anyway, here's a chart from, who is this from? Edison Research, and it shows the growth of podcasting over time. In fact, this could go back even farther. So podcasting is actually older than Facebook. It's older than Twitter. The emerging of podcasting as a technology is kind of concurrent with the rise of MySpace. So that you had the fall of mp3.com and the rise of MySpace happening. And around that time, podcasting started to take off in 2003, 2004. There's some earlier people who were doing podcasting a little bit before that. But we're talking 15 years plus of history and 15 years of slow and steady growth. So whole social network empires have been created and fallen in the time that podcasting is slowly adding 1% or 2% market share. And that is substantive. That is true growth. If this were a stock, like a company, you'd be like, okay, this is a company that has been showing steady increases for a long period of time. Not that I advocate technical analysis of stocks and looking at charts for making stock decisions. But anyway, listen to a different podcast for financial advice. But the point I'm trying to make is you're not going to see podcast growth fall off a cliff like you would see MySpace usage fall off a cliff, where suddenly everyone was using it and now everyone isn't. Everyone's using Friendster, no one's using Friendster. And this is another advantage actually of the decentralized nature of podcasting. Even if a company stopped doing podcasts for whatever reason, the rest of the ecosystem would continue to function, which is really beautiful. So hopefully I have your attention now. You're like, okay, you've convinced me. Podcasting is powerful. Now what? Well, let's talk about 3 ways to leverage the power of podcasts. The first way is as a listener. So the best way to listen to podcasts is to download an app on your smartphone. Excuse me. The app that I recommend for Android is an app called Castbox. It's free, which is really good because there's a lot of really terrible free apps on Android, but this one is a good one. It's a VC-backed company that's really put a lot of effort into their app. And they have some cool features like tags. You can put the different podcasts that you subscribe to in tags that kind of act as categories. So you can listen to those podcasts in certain contexts. And I'll show you how I do that in the next one. It also has a trim silence feature, which I really like. So it's a way of making a podcast go faster without feeling faster. So it just shortens the silences. And then CastBox also has a cool feature where it will sync between devices and even sync with their online interface. The downside of that is that you have to log in, but you don't have to. You can use the app just fine without creating an account. It also has a iPhone app. So if what I just described sounds cool to you, you can put it on your iPhone as well. But there is an even better app for the iPhone called Overcast. So Overcast can stream or download podcasts. So if you're on an older phone without a lot of space, you don't have to download the episodes. It has the technology to stream it, which is really nice. It also is the highest privacy app. So Overcast doesn't sell or share your listening data with anyone else. And the guy, it's just run by a dude. So it's not like a VC-backed company. It's just like this, one of the like old wizards of podcasting who's kind of the crotchety libertarian type that used to be very common in podcasting. I don't know what his personal politics are, but he's not in the selling your privacy business, which I really respect. And it has smart playlists that kind of act like categories or tags in CastBox. And a thing that I really like is that you can set a custom playback speed per podcast. So if there's one podcast that I like, but the people talk really, really slow, I can crank that one up really fast. If there's another podcast I like where they're already talking pretty fast, I may not increase the speed as much. Scott, what app do you use out of curiosity?
I just listen to the regular iPhone app because I have an iPhone.
You use the default app?
Yeah. Now I use, when I have an Android as well too, that I'll use Stitcher and listen to them on Androids that way.
Yep.
But usually I just use the default app.
Yep. The default app is the most popular app. And if you're a podcaster, it makes sense to subscribe to your own podcast in the Apple app just to know what most of your listeners are experiencing. All right, so that's step one. Step two is you search in the app, whatever app you're using, whether it's Stitcher, Overcast, or CastBox, for the podcast you want to subscribe to. And a couple of podcasts that I would recommend. Novel Marketing is my podcast, and then two others that are both really good. 20,000 Hertz is all about audio, and it's really fascinating. It's like about how the sound effects for movies are made. It's really interesting storytelling. And then 99% Invisible is similar, but about design and architecture. And these are both really fascinating podcasts. And then, of course, the Note Closers Show. Make sure you listen to the Note Closers Show. Can't not give that shout out. So now that you've searched for the podcast, you're like, I want to listen to the Note Closer Show, Scott Carson. Step 3 is to subscribe. And the more podcasts you subscribe to, the more you might want to put these into categories, however your app does it. So for my app, my current categories are business, geopolitics, history, Margaret. So this is a special category of podcasts my wife also likes to listen to, so that if we're in the car together, I know which ones are good, because she gets very bored with all of my history podcasts that I listen to. I have a category just for my own podcasts, because I listen to all of my own podcasts, news, religious, and then I just created a new one called Short, which are just podcasts from the other categories, but that are 10 minutes or less. So if I have a quick drive somewhere, I want to listen to a short podcast, I'll just start playing the short playlist. And this is one of the nice features of the more powerful apps over the default apps, is that you can put your podcast into categories. And then step 4 is listen. So once you're subscribed, new episodes will come to your phone automatically, but they only do you good if you actually listen to them. So buying a book doesn't help you. Reading a book helps you, and the same is true for podcasts. And you now have the power to learn anything you want. So we talked about using podcasts as a listener. Now let's talk about using podcasts as a guest. Being a guest on other podcasts gives you the power of the podcast without all of the work. So a lot of work goes into producing a podcast. There's dealing with hosting, there's creating the MP3 files, there's post-production, there's editing, there's scheduling and booking guests. There's a lot of work in having your own podcast. And the guest just shows up and talks and then shuts up, and the episode goes out to all of the subscribers of that podcast. It's a really great, it's a great deal. So I encourage you to look into being a guest on podcasts. And it's also a high credibility way of reaching new audiences. So while this is not a podcast, this is a webinar, at least the live version is a webinar, the fact that Scott had me on, he granted unto me during his interview credibility, right? He's like, hey, this is Thomas. I vouch for him. You should listen to him. And that is really powerful. This would have been more valuable than if I had come on this webinar as an advertiser, right? Because, I could have paid Scott potentially, hey, Scott, here's $10,000, run this ad for me. And he would have run it, but that would have been a lower credibility to come on the show than to come on as a guest. And then a tool that I've developed is the podcast host directory, which has the email addresses of over 100,000 podcasters. So if you want to get in touch with them.
Awesome.
Have you tried it out? Have you used it?
Oh yeah. I've tried it out. It's come in handy definitely quite a bit.
The one feature that it doesn't have and probably will never have is CSV export, because we don't want you spamming podcasters. This is for emailing bespoke introductions to specific podcasters, which, by the way, is a really important tip. Listen to the podcast before you pitch the podcast. So I've got some other guesting tips, but this one is really needs to be said. Since podcasts are so focused, you have to demonstrate to that podcast host that you can adapt your topic to their focused audience. And if you take the same pitch and send it to 2 or 3 podcasts, or God forbid, 30 podcasts or 300 podcasts, they're all going to say no because you're not adapting it for their audiences. Scott, I don't know how many pitches you get for people wanting to be guests on your show.
Oh, I get quite a few actually in the real estate community. They pitch and I'm like, listen, it's not a fit. Or we just had somebody on recently. I mean, it's funny. I'm like, just not a fit for our niche. And It is what it is.
It is what it is. And so there's a way to do it right and there's a way to do it poorly. And those people probably could have done a better job being on your show. The ones who came on your show and the people who pitched you probably could have done a better job as well. So we'll talk a little more about that. Another thing that's key is to buy a real microphone. So if you're a guest on a show and you're doing the majority of the talking, your audio becomes the show's audio. And if your audio is bad, the whole show's audio is bad. And the more popular the show is, the more they demand good audio from their guests. So if you want to get on big shows, you have to have good audio. And when I was a kid starting in podcasting, this meant spending a lot of money and buying a lot of gear. You had to buy a good microphone and plug it into a box that then plugged into your computer, and you had to loop it through. It was very complicated. Now you can do all of that in one piece of technology. So the new microphone I've switched to recommending just last week is a Samsung Q2U, and you can get a whole kit of all of the stuff on Amazon. And we have a link. I have a gear guide that you can get, authormedia.com/gear. But let me show you this mic. So I have tested this mic. I have purchased and tested an embarrassingly high number of mics. I keep telling myself I'm going to have like a podcast gear sale and sell all of this gear that I bought often just for the purpose of testing. But this is the Samsung Q2U. And on the back here, you'll see it's got a big XLR input. So you can plug it into a preamp or a mixer, but it also has a USB input where you can plug it directly into your computer. So this microphone can grow with you. So when you're first getting started doing guest interviews, you plug it straight into your computer and it's fine. You want to have a slightly better audio, you want to start producing your own podcast, you want to get a mixer or a preamp, you can plug it into that preamp. You later on in your career, you want to get a $400 microphone like the one I'm talking to, you throw this in your travel bag. You could still use it. Or you get multiple of them and you do it for like a multiple guest setup if you want to record people live, and you never have to replace the microphone. You can keep using the same mic, and so it's not wasted money. I really like the Q2U. I used to recommend the ATR 2100, which is also a good mic. I have several of those, but the Q2U is slightly better made. It's a little heavier, it's a little heftier, it sounds a little bit better, and it's cheaper, which is why I switched my recommendation and checked all the boxes. So I really like this mic. Now, I have a course that is releasing next week or the next week on how to get booked as a podcast guest, where I go in depth on how to reach out to podcasters and how to do a good job. And this is something I know a lot about. I've hosted 5 different podcasts myself, starting in 2007 is when I started my first one. And I had a radio show where I interviewed a lot of people, and I have done good interviews and I've done bad interviews. In fact, we once interviewed a PR guy to talk about PR on our podcast. Yeah. His interview was so bad, we couldn't air it. And we're like, come on, you're a professional PR expert. You, of all people, should be able to do a good interview. And it was seriously, it was awful. It was terrible. So we're going to teach you how to not do that, how to become a more attractive podcast guest, the kind of guest that podcasters actually want to reach out to, where they ask you to come on rather than the other way around. Where to find podcasts to pitch, where to find the ones that are really easy to pitch if you're first getting started and you're needing practice, all the way to the really popular ones. And then how to pitch podcast, including a fill-in-the-blank template of exactly what to say that will help you customize a pitch specifically for each podcast. And by filling in the blanks, you'll have to do a little bit of research, right? This is not a blast everyone template, but it is a very effective template. And then how to nail podcast interviews. This is based off of hundreds of hours on both sides of the microphone. I've learned a lot the hard way. I've learned a lot the hard way. And you can learn it easier from my mistakes. I also have a really useful pre-flight checklist that you can make sure everything is ready to go beforehand. And then interview mistakes to avoid, and a whole bunch more. So this course, by the end of the course, you will know how to find podcasts that want to book you, pitch them in a way where they will want to say yes, and nail the interview so they want to have you back. So don't be like that real estate agent Scott had on recently who was like, oh, I'm glad that interview is over. We're never having you back, right? You want to have guests who are like, oh my, or you want to be the kind of guest or the host like, wow, when can I book you again? I'd love to have you. Again, this has been a great experience. And I've had that experience on both sides, right? I've been invited back as a guest, and I've invited people back as a guest. And I've also not invited people back as a guest. So, and if you download the gear guide, we'll let you know when that course is available. I'm sorry, it's not available yet, but I have been traveling. All right. So real quickly, we talked about how to leverage the power of podcast as a guest. We've talked about how to do it as a listener. Now let's talk about how to do it as a host. Being a podcast host is really powerful. It's almost scarily powerful. Your subscribers will spend more time listening to your voice than they will their own mother's voice. Like Scott, like your show is what? An hour every day, 30 minutes every day?
Yeah, at least about an average of 45 minutes a day, yeah.
Okay, so it's 45 minutes a day. Nobody talks to their mom for 45 minutes a day, like unless they live with their mom, in which case it's probably not your target audience. But think about that. You're in their head more than their mom is in their head. That is really powerful. That is a place of privilege, and it's one to not be taken lightly. So some advice if you're thinking about starting your own podcast. And I put all of my least popular advice here in this talk. But this is all solid advice. And Scott, I imagine will back me up on this. So the first is listen to 20 different podcasts before starting your own. The more different kinds of podcasts you listen to, the more you'll learn about podcasting, because each category of podcasts does things a little bit differently, and there are ideas you can steal from podcasts. Listen to at least one history podcast. You can pick the history you want. There's a lot of great history podcasts, and history podcasters do community better and collaboration better than any other kind of podcaster. I remember I was listening to it's a little embarrassing, Scott, but I listened to the History of Byzantium podcast because the history of Rome was not esoteric enough for me. And although the Byzantines arguably called themselves Romans, so you could say it was like History of Rome extended edition. But anyway, the Byzantiums had this Varangian Guard. So this is an empire that was based in Greece, and they had this Varangian Guard, which were basically Viking mercenaries that were the defenders of the emperor. And they weren't involved in politics. They didn't speak the language. They had a different religion. And they're these giant, bearded Thor-like people who just stood around the emperor very intimidatingly. And the host of that show had the History of Vikings host on to do a collaboration episode talking about the Byzantines and the Vikings and how they coordinated and how horrified the Byzantines were to find that not all the Vikings were men. Some of them were shield maidens. Like, how is this woman 6 foot tall? Nothing makes sense in the world. And it was really fascinating. It was a fascinating episode, and they do that great. So listen to lots of different kinds of podcasts, and then listen to 100 episodes total. Not 100 episodes of each show, but 100 episodes total. Because I do a lot of podcast coaching, and I help a lot of people launch podcasts. And it's very obvious early, and I often ask a lot of questions before I take on a client, like, how familiar are you with podcasting? And a lot of people heard podcasting on the news, like, I got to start a podcast. I heard about it on the news. It's going to make me rich. And it's like, your podcast, if you don't listen to podcasts yourself, is going to be terrible. It's going to be so bad. And you're going to give up, and you're going to fail, and it's going to be a big waste of money, and you're going to be very unhappy. So here's the wonderful thing about listening to 20 different shows and 100 episodes. It doesn't cost you any money. The phone that you have can listen to these episodes. Even if you have an old broke down Android phone, you can get an app. I think CastBox will stream as well. Somebody in the chat can confirm that if CastBox has streaming built in. But you don't have to have a fancy phone to listen to podcasts. And you can also listen to podcasts about podcasting, which in the early days of podcasting, there used to be a whole category in the iTunes store just for podcasts about podcasting, because navel gazing was like the quintessentially identifiable thing of the mid 2000s, right? Blogs about blogging and podcasts about podcasting. There's still a bunch that are out there that's still active, and many of them are very, very good. And then one final tip, if you're thinking about starting your own podcast, and that is to focus on thrilling a specific audience first. When we started Novel Marketing, our focus was on marketing fiction. And as the podcast grew, it's the longest running book marketing podcast in the world. As the podcast grew, our target audience grew. We surveyed our listeners. We found out we had a bunch of nonfiction authors who'd snuck in and were listening anyway, and both indie and traditional. But when we started, it was fiction and it was traditional only. And by thrilling that audience, those people talked and spread the word. You know, Scott, your podcast is super focused, right? You didn't start with here's how to get rich with real estate podcast, because there's a million of those.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And they're really good, and they're by gurus, and they've been doing it for 5 years or 10 years longer than you have. And if you look at them in the early days, they often started off really focused, right? They grew and earned themselves that general focus, and they didn't start there. And so often people want to start a podcast on some general topic. And I've made that mistake. I had a podcast that was on politics. Any politics, whatever we want to talk about. We just me and another guy talking about politics for 30 minutes and rambling on and on. It was great fun for us, and we had some loyal listeners, but it wasn't like a set the world on fire political podcast. It didn't help that we refused to take sides on a lot of. Anyway, it's neither here. I'm gonna try to keep from alienating anyone here with podcasts. I've done a pretty good job of avoiding politics so far. So that's what I have in terms of the talk. Open for questions, Scott. I don't know if you have set up, or people can type in questions, or if any questions come in, or if you have any questions.
Yeah, so you talk a little about kind of novel market, because you guys, you do a lot with books. And you know, you and I both have been plenty of events where people are coming out with the books and they're trying to go on the whole podcasting thing. Let's talk about kind of the opposite. People that have a podcast and then take what a lot of their content is and turn it into a book. How have you dealt with anybody that's done that before? Do you think it's effective?
I can give you lots of stories of people who have started with a podcast and ending with a book. And in fact, that's like, it used to be like the go-to way of monetizing a podcast in the olden days. So, you know, the guy I talked about at the beginning, Mike, with the History of Rome, did it. There was a podcast still running called Grammar Girl. I don't know if you're familiar with this podcast, but again, talking about a niche topic. She's like, I want to do a podcast and talk about English grammar. Like, who's excited for that? Well, it turns out like 1 million people were excited. There are 1 million grammar Nazis in this world, and they've been waiting their entire life for someone to start a podcast just for them, to talk about the difference between there, and there, and when to use one and when to use the other. And they'd all secretly forward it to their friends who broke whatever grammar rule. And it was a brilliant podcast. She launches a book about grammar, which again, it's like not yawn, New York Times bestseller for a book about grammar. And it works for fiction too. So there was an author, what is his name? I'm blanking on his name, Scott Sigler, who was writing in a genre that didn't really exist at the time. He'd pitched to all the major publishers. They'd all turned him down. So he started podcasting his novel as he went, in one chapter per episode, and he'd get feedback from his super fans, and he'd occasionally write them in. So like if you did certain things, you gave lots of feedback, or you donated money, you got to be a corpse, because they were like horror movies, a really high body count. So it wasn't like unnamed people dying. These were like his own listeners he was killing off in his podcast, in his book. And he eventually got so many listeners that he got either a 3 or 5 book deal with Penguin Random House, and his books started hitting the New York Times bestseller list. And I remember walking into a Barnes & Noble, and the guy who'd been turned down by everyone had his book facing the door walking into the Barnes & Noble here in Austin, Texas. And I'm like, podcasting is changing the world. And so a lot of people approach it backwards, where they write a book and then they want to start a podcast to promote the book. It's not a good strategy. If you've written a book and you're wanting to promote the book, you're better off with a guesting strategy, where you're a guest on a bunch of other people's podcasts to talk about your book. If it's a good book, there's probably a lot of podcasts that would love to have you on as a guest. And it's very easy to do that, and that's very effective. Whereas starting your own show is really slow. I mean, Scott, how many listeners did you have on episode 1 of your show?
Golly. I haven't had that. I didn't have that many to begin with. I mean, I
Like
think
10, maybe 20.
Yeah.
Your mom, right? Like podcasting starts really slow. It becomes this like huge snowball eventually where it like wipes out whole little small villages on the sides of the Alps, but it doesn't start that way. And oftentimes when people are launching a book, they're in a big rush, right? They want to start seeing sales this month, not like 2 years from now as they build up a reputation with their listeners. So podcasting is not a get rich technology. It's not a put you on the map overnight thing. It's not and I know people want to say that, and there are gurus who'll say, "Oh yeah, you can get quick results," and it's just not true. It's it's the tortoise. Podcasting growth, and the way to be successful in podcasting is that same slow and steady growth. And then after a while, once that flywheel starts spinning, growth happens really big. I mean, Scott, you probably saw this with your show where there was 1 month where you grew as much as like the last 4 months put together, last 5 months put together. You jumped up by that much again. You're like, oh my gosh. And it's finally people are talking, and that person has to hear about it 3 times before they'll check out the show. They had 3 different friends tell them about the show, and then they hear about it, and then they start talking. And that's good for you that it's slow like that, right? Because your first episodes aren't particularly good. I mean, Scott, you're probably different, right? Because you're but my early episodes were awful. Even after I'd started 2 or 3 podcasts, the early episodes are still awful. It takes a while to find your groove.
Yeah, it took a while to get rock and rolling, and it's the same. I listen to my first episodes now. Every once in a while, I go back and I just kind of cringe. I'm like, oh, that was ugly. It was horrible, And you develop and you get better at it. And we found the show's changed some over time, especially now that we hit our 500th episode. We're kind of like going back. Okay, let's tweak it up. Let's recycle a little bit of the different information as the market's changed. But it's that's the thing. It's a different show than it was 2 years ago, because actually today is the exact 2-year anniversary of when we actually launched the podcast itself versus doing Facebook Lives and then converted to a podcast.
Hey, happy birthday!
Thank you.
2 years old. You're all grown up now.
All right.
There's an old saying that the carpenter doesn't just build the house builds the carpenter.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same with podcasting. There's a lot to learn, and it's difficult, right? And the difficulty of getting the gear and getting guests and finding your voice and finding topics that resonate with your audience, all of those things being difficult are actually good for you, because it means that most people aren't going to go through the hassle of starting a podcast. Most people, when they find out how much work goes into it, they're like, I'd rather have a blog instead, or I'd rather just post to social media. And you're like, that's great, right? You're on social media, you're competing with 100 million people. You have a blog, you're competing with 10 million people perhaps. You have a podcast, the whole podcast ecosystem right now is like 1 million podcasts, maybe 2 million podcasts, and half of those are dormant, right? They aren't creating new episodes. So the actual competition is still relatively low, which is nice. There's not a lot of places on the internet right now with relatively low competition, especially with lots of user engagement.
Yeah, they were talking about it. Podcast being 760,000 shows, over half of them haven't done anything in 12 months. There's maybe really truly less than 250,000 true podcasts, even though a lot get started. Most of them never make it beyond 10 episodes. And that's the aspect of it. I'm a big believer that you should probably jot out your first 20, 30 episodes and just run with them. You know what I mean? Just get them down, get them out the ecosystem. If you can get to 20, then great. You've got some momentum to get rock and rolling. Whereas everybody does 2, 3 episodes and they just fall off because they don't make it a habit to do it on a regular basis. With you doing so many different shows, and you've helped a lot of authors out there too with their books, what do you see the biggest mistakes being from people, whether they're trying to write a book or to start a podcast? And there's 2 different things, but I'm willing to bet there's some similarities in success in what they're doing, huh?
Yeah, so probably the biggest mistake is not investing enough on education and insisting on learning it all the hard way. And there are a lot of ways of getting educated, right? The cheapest way to get educated is to walk yourself to the library and read a book about the thing. There are a lot of great books about writing. There are a lot of great books about podcasting, and you can read those books for free. Or for the astronomical price of $10 or $20, you can own your own copy of the book, right? So that's on the really low end, right? There's really no financial reason not to buy a book about something. You're like, well, I need something more interactive. I need video. It's like, okay, There are videos on the thing, right? There are YouTube videos on the thing. There are podcasts that you can listen to on the thing. You're like, I need more than that. I need somebody to hold my hand. Guess what? There are courses. There are instructors like me, people that create whole educational experiences that will walk you through step by step. So wherever you are in terms of like whether you're time rich or cash rich, because I feel like that really makes a difference, right? If you're time rich and cash poor, go to the library. Or watch YouTube videos. Figure it out yourself. The information is out there. If you're cash rich and time poor, hire somebody to do a lot of it for you, or go through a course that makes it really easy. If you're time poor and cash poor, don't start. You need to reevaluate your priorities. Go get a job. Learn a skill. In fact, I will say, if you're time poor and cash poor, the best job you can get is being a VA for either a podcaster or an author, somebody who's already doing it, where you are just helping them for an hourly wage, and they are paying you, but you're in the game. You're interacting with other podcasters or other authors. You're seeing how they do it. I have a friend of mine. I'm in a mastermind group, and one of the authors in the mastermind group is a very advanced author. And the other author, and one of the other authors, was kind of a beginner to journeyman level when she started with our group. And she got hired in the mastermind group by this advanced author as a VA, and they are now queens of their genre. The author, too, is no longer a VA. She is writing books that are selling tons and tons of copies because she learned a lot being a VA, and she learned enough eventually where she now has VAs of her own. So that's a great way to do it, and to investigate education or skipping that, I think, is really important. And people often they underestimate the complexity of something they don't understand, right? Like building a dam. I don't really know how that's done. It can't be that hard. It's like, no, it's pretty complicated. And writing a book is the same way.
Somebody text me from online there and asked me the question: if you've written a book and you want to get booked, would you recommend actually sending out copies of that book to people you want to be on their podcast versus just reaching out to them?
Yeah, so we talk a lot about this in the course. So one of the most effective ways of building a connection with a podcaster is in person. You can shake somebody's hand, your likelihood of getting booked as a guest goes up by as much as 38%, which is a totally made up statistic, but it's totally true. So I don't know exactly what percentage it goes up, but I will say meeting somebody in person, right? Like Scott, I would have never been booked on this show if I hadn't met you in person, right? We met at a conference, and then we hung out a little bit after that. And after encountering each other a few times in person, you're like, okay, I don't think Thomas is a bozo. I'm willing to risk my audience, risk him on my audience, right? But if I had have approached you out of the blue, it would have been a lot harder. It still could have worked, and if I'd have used my template on you, I could have customized it, right, to make the right kind of pitch. But it's way easier meeting you in person. And this is where having the book kind of in your back pocket, so to speak, can be really powerful, right? So you shake their hand, you talk to them a little bit, and you're like, oh, by the way, I'm an author of a book. Here's a copy. You hand it to them. And, if you'd ever like to have me on your show, I'd be happy to talk about, this topic, and then you tailor it for their audience. It's a really powerful pitch. Where it doesn't work as well is when you're mailing out like dozens and dozens of copies. This can work. And if you do it targeted in a targeted way, it still can work. But it can get really expensive. So I would not carpet bomb strangers with copies of your book. And I don't actually see very many authors doing that, partly because it's so prohibitively expensive. When it's mailing somebody a copy of your books depending on how your book is printed, and let's say between $4 and $10 per podcaster, right? Once you do 10 podcasters, that's somewhere between $40 and $100. That's a lot of money for 10 podcasters that may or may not result in any pitches. But including in your pitch, hey, I'd be happy to send you a complimentary copy of my book to check out. Podcasters could be potentially very interested in that. Although, dirty little secret, we never read the book. So when I had a radio show, I had 2 hours of drive time to fill. That was 8, give or take, slots for interviews. And interviews often would go into two segments. So if they were not boring, I would hold them over to the second. So the first commercial was the go, no go. If they were too boring, they would not make it to the second segment. But I interviewed a lot of authors, and there was no way I could read all of those books. And a lot of podcasters are the same way. They're really busy. So while they might like getting your book as a gift, they don't expect them to have read your book in preparation for the interview. You need to come ready to do that interview, expecting them to have done no research. And if they have done research, so much the better. But you can't put it all on them.
Good answer to that. out there for people that were asking that. We got a newer podcaster, Thomas, and he asked the question: how long would you say that is the best time for a new podcast? Are we talking going an hour or going like the John Lee Dumas route of trying to crank up as many downloads in 15-minute increments?
So I have a somewhat controversial view on this. And I was at a podcast conference recently, and I heard, I think, the vice president of Libsyn saying, all the popular podcasts are really long. So if you want to have a popular podcast, your podcast needs to be really long. And I wanted to shout at him, post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is Latin for after this, therefore because of this. It is one of the classic fallacies, logical fallacies. Just because things are correlated doesn't mean that they're caused by each other. And a lot of people will point at hardcore history as the example of why you should have a long podcast, right? He does 5-hour-long podcasts, 6-hour-long podcasts, and he's one of the top podcasts in the world. So it doesn't matter how long your podcast is the argument. But here's the secret. If you actually follow Dan Carlin, you know how long his first podcast was? 15 minutes. And then it was like 18 minutes, and then he did a 20-minute one. He made his podcast longer when his fans asked him to make it longer. When your fans are asking for more of your show, that's when you make it longer. And you earn the right to make a 6-hour podcast that people like me will find 3 hours of my day to listen to a 6-hour podcast, because I listen at 2x speed. I'm not a crazy person, but I'll carve out 3 hours if he does a new podcast. Surprise me with it. I'll do whatever I can to listen to it the day it comes out, so I don't want anyone to spoil it for me. But he didn't start there. And I think that 20 to 30 minute window, which is the average length of most commutes and most workouts, and it's also like how much time people tend to spend preparing a meal and often cleaning up from a meal. Like a lot of those like zones where people listen to podcasts are in that time window. I think that's a good place to start, and then earn your way into longer podcasts. And I realize I'm in the minority opinion here, and a lot of people like talk for as long as you want, and that can work. We have clients that will have the 45-minute long interview show or the hour-long interview show, but I think it's better to learn first how to be interesting for 10 minutes and then learn to be interesting for 20 and earn your way up.
I actually agree with you there. I think it's, as I look back at our first episode.
Finally!
Well, because that's it. I started little nuggets each day. It was like 5 minutes or 8 minutes or 10 minutes, just a little what's going on in the world today, Scott, just to touch base with my audience. And it's grown. Now we do have some episodes that are over an hour. But for the most part, they're shorter. I'm really busy. I don't always have 3 hours to listen to a 6-hour podcast. I like the actual 30-minute to 1 hour increments that I can actually dive into. So,
and it's less work for you. You're less likely to pod fade if at the end of creating an episode, you're already ready to create the next episode. If you've put so much work into that 1 hour episode that you just did, you're exhausted. You're like, oh my gosh, can't imagine doing this again next week. You're never going to make it. You're going to give up before you get to critical mass.
Mm-hmm. Tom, what was the link again for the for your class? We saw the slide, but I don't think we saw the link there for people to sign up for it.
Yes, it's authormedia.com/gear. And that gives you my gear guide. So I have different setups. Like if you're a guest setup, if you're a host with an expensive setup. And I have a lot of different gear that I've tested that I recommend there. And then when you sign up for that, you'll be on our newsletter, and we'll let you know when the course is ready.
We got another question here. How are you using, or have you been using Patreon to help you monetize your podcast?
Yeah, so I actually had a whole podcast about using Patreon for bringing in money. So this is a topic I know a lot about and talk a lot about. I don't do that podcast anymore. I had a bit of a mental breakdown with 4 active podcasts and like 6 different companies that I was running. And so I started pruning, and that podcast sadly was one of the ones that got pruned, but the episodes are still available. So there's 29 episodes, and a lot of people just treat that like a masterclass on raising money through podcasts. Talk about 7 different ways of making money with your podcast, and I interview a lot of people who are making money with their podcasts, and we are doing really well with making money for novel marketing on Patreon. So it can be done. Patreon's not the only way to do it. We talked about a lot of other ways to do it, but I have on people from Patreon corporate talking about Patreon on the show. So, and specifically for podcasters. So that's creativefundingshow.com. But the short answer is yes, you can make money with Patreon, but you have to have the crowd first. You can't, don't launch with Patreon on day one when the only listener is your mom, because then the only person funding you on Patreon is your mom, and that's very obvious.
here's your weekly allowance, Sonny.
Thanks, Mom, for the $5.
Thanks, Grandma.
Not that I know anything about that. launch a Patreon too soon before I have the listeners to support it.
Yeah, that's the thing is you got to build an audience. If you build it, they will come, but you've got to build it first versus just trying to hit them over the head for, hey, fund my show. You know, what are they funding? They don't know. So one final question, and then I'll let you get back to the fam here. Spend a little time with your wife there. What you shared one thing with me. You shared it a lot. Every time I've sat down with you or we've met at a meetup or a networking event, you're always dropping just knowledge bombs. So this is kind of a twofold, I guess you could say, final question. One, is there something you subscribe to on a daily or weekly basis to keep up with information that's going on in the podcast industry? And what's been one thing you've learned recently that's just been like, oh, that's such a cool thing when it comes to podcasting?
So podnews.net is a 2-minute to 3-minute daily podcast, and it's brilliant. It's so good. And there's an email newsletter companion, and I get both of those because it really covers the whole industry really well. And that what's nice about getting the emails well is that he'll link to the articles he covers. So he'll like give the headline of an article, and I'm like, ooh, that's really interesting. I'll go and click that. The biggest thing for me in terms of kind of things that are shaking the industry is what a big play Spotify is making into podcasting. So they have spent $200 or $300 million over the last 12 months buying podcasting companies. And a lot of people don't understand why they're doing that. And I will explain exactly why they are doing it. So Spotify emerged in the days of Napster when everyone was pirating music, and Spotify was run by a bunch of law-abiding Europeans, and they didn't pirate. They wrote deals with the record companies. They're like, if you let us play your Taylor Swift song, we'll give you a fraction of a penny. And the record labels were like, well, gosh, a fraction of the penny is better than nothing. And so they made that deal, and they pay. Every time you listen to a song on Spotify, Spotify actually pays each time you play it, a small fraction of a penny. They renegotiated a few years, and that fraction of a penny got to be a bigger fraction of a penny. And suddenly, Spotify is paying millions of dollars in royalties to all these different record labels. And they're like, well, this is really harder to make money. And then somebody at Spotify had the brilliant idea of like, if we put podcasts on this, we wouldn't have to pay the podcasters, but we could still put ads on that audio. And, the people who pay for Spotify, they were listening to 20 hours of music a week, and they're paying for it. Now they're listening to 18 hours of music a week and 2 free hours of podcasts. We can reduce our costs by 10%. And everyone was like, oh my gosh, this is the idea. This was what's going to save the company. And so they were like, let's buy every podcasting company we can. And it's working actually for them. They now have the second biggest market share of any podcast listening service. And they control that whole ecosystem. And you can listen to a podcast in Spotify, which you couldn't really do. You could kind of sort of do it a year ago, 2 or 3 years ago. You couldn't do it at all. And this is huge for them because it's a really high margin form of audio. And as a podcaster, you're okay with them giving it away for free because hopefully you're making money off the audio in other ways, and having access to that bigger audience and having it served from their servers is kind of nice. There's been some drama over whether you get the usage analytics. So they let you get the analytics and they took it away, and I think they've given it back for the pass-through downloads. I'm not sure on the most recent update on that drama, but I see that as that kind of the biggest thing where Apple is now, Apple and Spotify are going to war. They have Apple Music and Spotify are direct competitors, and Spotify is making a play into Apple's kind of free backyard. Apple does nothing for their podcasting community. They don't hardly ever update their app. For a while, they only had like a handful of developers who worked on it. They had bugs that were around for a year. Knew it was broken for all of 2015 almost. And now suddenly Apple's scared. And to compete with Spotify, they're starting to pour in resources again into podcasting because they're like, because they have the same business model. Apple Music pays the royalties, and I think it's the exact same royalties Spotify pays on a per song basis. And they're realizing they don't want to lose this market share on podcasts to Spotify. So they actually have rolled out an update to the Apple Podcasts for the first time in I can't remember how long, or they're adding new categories. And I was like, oh, you're acknowledging the fact that we exist. Thank you so much, Apple. Because they were for a while taking features away. GarageBand was better for podcasts in 2010 than it was in 2018. there were more podcasting features. There's a whole podcasting mode you could go into in GarageBand that is gone now. Anyway, I won't complain about Apple too much because they've done a lot of good things for the community, and I'm glad that they're back throwing us a bone.
Exactly. Well, good stuff out there. Well, any other questions for Thomas before we let him get rocking and rolling back to his familia here in Austin? You are hanging out here. You also are one of the big guys with the Austin Podcasters, one of the moderators of that group out there as well. So I encourage everybody that's listening, go check out the Austin Podcast group as well out there besides the Syntax Podcasters too. It's a great group.
Yes, Austin Podcast Meetup is launching a new kind of mini meetup inside of the meetup for fiction podcasters. So if you are a novelist, I know some of the people listening are novelists, and you're thinking about turning your story into a novel and you're wanting to add some dramatization, some music, the expectation for production is a little bit higher for fiction. We're starting to explore that as a group, and Mark Askew, our organizer, is spearheading that, which I think is really fun. Fiction podcasting had its heyday in 2010. It kind of died down, and it's coming back, and I think that's a really great thing for the industry. We cover regular podcasting as well, but that's our new thing, which I really want to encourage.
Yeah, Marcus and I were actually talking about that in podcast. So sitting behind him in a couple of the sessions we were visiting and talking about some of that fun stuff that you guys are working on. So that's kudos to you guys. But Thomas, thanks so much, man. Thanks for just dropping some knowledge bombs out there. Appreciate it. You're on the south side. I'm on the north side. We got to figure out some way to get in lunch at some point and hang out a little bit more. So, right, brother?
There you go. All right. Thank you all very much. Live long and prosper.
Great stuff out there. Good stuff. All right, guys. Well, hey, that's going to wrap it up for this episode of Podcasters Live Stream. Thank you so much for listening and being on here. If you enjoyed it, click on a like on it if you're watching this on Facebook, or leave a comment on YouTube. And we'll be glad to keep doing this as long as you guys keep listening. Otherwise, we'll go out, take action, and we'll see you all at the top, everybody.